She is well, Jesse is her brother. Say it that way, just so you know. So indeed they are related, if there was any doubt. Julia is a editor, journalist, and blogger who lives in Washington and lives in New York City. I don't know that. But grew up in Washington, D.C. Okay, all right, there we go. Here's a connection, or an excuse or something.
Okay, cool.
She blogs and podcasts with Massimo Pigliucci, who always had Massimo to their campus. I know he gets around and does debates. No? Okay. You should have him come out. You should have Julia come out, too. She's fantastic. But anyway, she is going to tell you about moderating discussions. So thank you very much, Julia.
Is this, everyone hear me okay? Yes? No? You have to give me an extra minute now. I promise.
Yeah. 2 minutes.
You get a nice shot. Working? Yes? Everyone? Okay.
All right. So what I'm going to give you today is a very detail-oriented, very methodical, and step-by-step approach to moderating panel discussions. Some might say a neurotic approach to moderating panel discussions, which would be a well-taken point. And that's partly just my personal preference, that I like to sort of micromanage things. But it's also my philosophy that moderating panels is an art, and that like other art forms, you ultimately want it to feel and look effortless and intuitive, but you can't just jump to that point. That when you're starting out, you really do need to carefully plan out what to do, pay attention to all the little details because they matter, and then ultimately it will feel intuitive once those become second nature to you. So you can think of my talk as sort of a scaffolding with which to construct your moderation skills, and then you can throw it out when you no longer need it. So to start out, it's before the panel, you've got your topic. The key, one of the biggest keys to moderating a good panel is coming up with good questions. In order to do that, you need to know about your panelists. So you should be looking for what are their specific areas of expertise, what are they known for, what have they written anything that's well known, what are their ideologies relevant to your panel topic. So you should be doing background research on them, reading their articles, looking for blog posts, maybe checking out one of their well-known books, staking out their house, going through their trash. Don't do that, no. And what you should be looking for are, aside from their basic positions, are areas of overlap between your panelists, because those are the areas that you're going to want to encourage discussion about in the panel. So, for example, a couple weeks ago, I moderated a panel at the Amazing Meeting in Vegas, and the topic was paranormal investigations. So I was looking for overlap in the kinds of paranormal investigations that my panelists had done. So it's like, oh, okay, they've all investigated a haunted house, so I can ask questions about detecting ghosts. But the other thing that you're looking for is differences between your panelists, because you want to bring those to the fore in a panel, and because a good panel has some contention, has disagreement and debate, and that's where the real meat is. I would also advise, if it's at all possible, to find older podcasts and radio, TV interviews with your panelists, because that's going to give you a good sense of their speaking style, and that can be really useful in figuring out how you should be moderating them in particular. So, for example, you might find that one of your panelists tends to answer questions in a very succinct and literal and to-the-point way, doesn't elaborate on his points unless directed to. So for someone like that, you might want to avoid asking him questions where he can just answer with a yes or no answer, and instead start your questions like, can you describe for us, sort of thing. And alternatively, you might have a panelist who you notice in his interviews tends to have very polished, prepackaged spiels that he gives, which is just like death to an audience. And so for him, you don't want to give him open-ended questions. You don't want to give him any wiggle room because he's going to use it to recite his prepackaged spiel. So instead, you really want to pin him down with your question. Would you agree with the point that such and such? If not, why not? So that can be really helpful. You can also use older interviews to get a sense of what kinds of questions your panelists will have interesting answers to. Which brings me to my next point, which is when I first started doing this, I think I had the assumption that interesting questions will lead to interesting answers. This is not true, sadly. So I can give you an example. At the paranormal investigations panel, when I was preparing, I was really tempted to ask my panelists, so are there any cases that you weren't able to solve? And this seemed really promising to me. I thought, well, they're going to describe these intriguing unsolved mysteries. It's going to be fascinating. And then I was listening to some podcasts with my panelists ahead of time, and they got asked that question, and the answer that they all gave was essentially, no. Sometimes a case will be inconclusive, but that's because we don't have enough information. And I heard that, I was like, oh, that makes sense. That's probably what I should have expected. That's also not at all interesting. So I'm glad I didn't ask that question. So what does make a good question? Well, I think the rule that I like to keep in mind is to think about what type of response your question could lead to. And you want to think not just about the best case responses like I was doing, but also worst case responses. So a distinction that I like to make is between questions that are open, exploratory questions, like have you ever encountered such and such, or have you learned anything from such and such experiences, and those can have really interesting answers, but they can also have an answer that's like, oh, no, actually, I haven't ever encountered that, and then that's sort of fell flat. So that's one kind of question. Then the other kind of question is maybe you could call it a positional question, like what is your position on this issue? And everyone has a position, so it's sort of a safer bet in a way. But that's not to say that you shouldn't ask the exploratory questions. I think the key to the success of the exploratory questions is just doing your homework to make sure that your panelists have said or written something that will be a good answer to your question. So it's sort of like what lawyers say, that you shouldn't ask a question that you don't know the answer to. And they may not think to say exactly what you want them to say. You can't. It's not a puppet show. You can't make them say exactly what you want, as much as I might wish to. But you can prompt them if they don't, give an answer you were hoping they would give. You can say, well, Joe, you've written about this this case that you worked on. Can you tell us about that? So that also works. And you might be tempted, especially if you're nervous about your panel going well, to talk your topic over with your panelists ahead of time. This is really problematic, though, especially if you're going to be discussing with the panelists together, like at a conference, before the panel, just chatting with them beforehand. It's problematic partly because it robs your panel of spontaneity. Audience members want to see a genuine conversation. They want to see panelists reacting to each other. Someone makes a point, and someone else says, really? You're not going to get that if the panelists have already had this discussion. Also, as I said, a good panel has contention in it. And sometimes panelists want to avoid contention, and you want to not let them avoid it. So if you let the panelists talk to each other beforehand, the people who want to steer away from confrontation will be able to recognize what the hot button topics are and then avoid them in the actual panel. Relatedly, it's one of the most interesting things for audience members is to see one panelist rebutting a point made by another panelist. So if you let the panelists talk to each other ahead of time, panelist A is going to make a point, panelist B rebuts it, and then panelist A doesn't bring it up in the actual panel, and that's a shame because then the audience doesn't get to hear the interesting rebuttal. So another alternative is to talk to panelists separately before the panel, which I've tried. And that does preclude some of the problems I talked about, but it's still somewhat tricky because what I've found, to my surprise, was that oftentimes panelists will make really interesting points to me ahead of time, and then they won't bring them up in the panel at all. And I've been trying to hypothesize why this is. I think to some degree they just sort of they feel like embarrassed about saying the same thing twice, or maybe they like sort of they have the sense that they've already said it and they don't remember that they haven't said it in the panel and they've just said it to me. So that's a shame. I feel like you risk wasting some good material there by pre-gaming. So my preferred solution, weighing these pros and cons, is to talk to the panelists separately, just give them the brief rundown of topics I want to cover, not specific questions, and then ask them if they have any suggested questions that they think I should bring up. You don't have to bring them up, but it might give you some good ideas you hadn't thought of. Backstage, just some basic housekeeping tips. You should ask the panelists to make sure you've got the pronunciation of their names right, that you've got their correct titles, where they work and what their position is. If they want you to mention anything in particular when you're introducing them, like maybe they've just written a book and they'd like you to mention it, let them know what the format's going to be like, if they're going to be giving a closing statement, if there will be audience questions. And then for yourself, you're going to want some note-taking implement and a timekeeping device. At the Northeast Conference on Science and Skepticism, where I moderated earlier this year, I used my cell phone as a timekeeping device, which I thought would be fine because the conference didn't have any reception. And then turns out the stage is the one place that gets reception at this conference. So I had my cell phone on the podium, and I got a text message in the middle of the conference, and it beeped really loudly, which was awkward. And ironically, the text message said, "Hey, Julia, I hope your panel went off without a hitch." So yeah, don't do that. All right, so you're on stage, and you're introducing the topic. You want to give like a brief, pithy, concentrated intro to the topic, and the goal here is to sort of frame it for your audience and for the panel so they know what direction you want to take it in. So like at the Nexus conference, the topic was talking to non-skeptics, and so in my intro I mentioned TV interviews, I mentioned debates, I mentioned like one-on-one informal conversations, because I wanted to cue the panelists to think about these things when they were answering my questions, if maybe those contexts hadn't occurred to them. Just as an aside, I realized as I was preparing this talk that I am now moderating a discussion about discussion, which may be the most meta thing I've ever done in my life. I couldn't resist pointing that out. One thing to keep in mind when you're doing an intro, and also when you're asking your questions, is that this panel is not about you. I think the temptation, which I know I've felt, is to try to be really brilliant and make intelligent points in your questions and in your intro. And the audience is not here to see you. They're here to see the panel. So keep your questions brief and clear and direct. That's really, you can see this style in some of the best interviewers on TV if you want to look for tips on how to be a good interviewer. Which leads into my next point, which is that you should be listening to your panelists. This is supposed to be a conversation. So you don't want to come with a list of preset questions and just read them off and have your panelists answer. You need to listen so that you can be responding to what they say with your follow-up questions. And also, one thing I really like in a moderator is when they intermittently sort of sum up for the audience and frame what you've just heard in the last few minutes of discussion. So you might say something like, so it sounds like you all agree that skeptics need to be public and reach out to the media, but Steve thinks that TV is always a bad idea because we can never come off well. And then you can move on to the next question, but the audience now has this nice little cliff notes that helps them retain what they've heard. Problem is, you can never listen with really more than half a brain, because you need the other half of your brain to be thinking about a whole host of other things. For example, time. You don't want to go over. You don't want to miss out on your best questions. You need to be thinking ahead, thinking what question can I ask after this that'll relate. And you should be also looking out for things like which of the panelists hasn't spoken enough? Is someone really falling behind in terms of time? In which case you want to be thinking about, is there a question I can throw their way later on to sort of balance it out? My approach that I've been tending towards in moderating is to try to control the discussion in as invisible a way as possible to make it look like I'm not controlling the discussion. So I've been developing ways to do this. One thing I try to do is to, ahead of time, I'll come up with a list of really key points or questions that I want to get to, but I want to make it feel like they arise organically out of conversation. So for each point, I'll come up with topics that are related to it, that could lead into it, and so then I'll just keep an eye out for when those topics arise, and it forms the perfect segue into my question, which I always intended to bring up, but it feels like it just arose spontaneously, which is nice when you can pull that off. Remember, the panel is not your friend. You're not there to impress or make friends with the panelists. You are there as a representative for the audience, to ask questions that the audience wants to hear the answer to. So that means you should cut off panelists when they ramble or start to go into their talking points. The audience doesn't want to hear that. And it can be tricky when you're a newbie and these are esteemed, prestigious people, but you really should try. And it also means that you should follow up. If a panelist doesn't answer a question properly, if he avoids the question, you can press him on it and say, that doesn't sound like that quite answered the question. You can restate it. The audience will love you for it. Audience questions. I'm not a fan of audience questions. I get that they're important, and sometimes there's a real gem that makes it all worth it, but God, there's just something about holding out a mic and inviting anyone to come up and ask a question that just brings out the crazies. And usually the form that this takes is someone who, they have their own personal issue, and they'll come up and they'll give this long, intense, and rambling rant about it. And sometimes they don't even put a question mark at the end of it. And when they do, it's like this very perfunctory, so yeah, I was wondering if you have a comment on that. So you need to be actually moderating the audience as well as the panelists. There are a couple things you can do. You should cut off an audience member if they're going on too long, or if you can sense that this is just going to be a long rant, you can interrupt them and say, we need a question here. Can you rephrase that as a question? And another trick that I really like is repeating the question that was just asked. And partly that's a practical thing because the audience may not have heard properly, especially if you're not using mics. But the other cool thing this lets you do is it lets you rephrase the question to sort of make it less deranged and more useful to the audience. So, for example, if someone gets up there and gives a long rant about how the moon landing was a hoax, you can say, this happens all the time. You can say, Mr. Distinguished Panelist, the question was, about the moon landing being a hoax. Maybe you could comment on why this belief has been so persistent. There you go. Less deranged, and it's actually an interesting question now. All right, informal discussions. A few of my friends and I have been leading these sort of structured but informal group discussions for Meetup. I've done a couple for the Center for Inquiry, and I think it's a really good kind of event to have for organizations like you guys to really hash out some of the interesting topics in your fields. And so we've sort of been developing some to-dos and to-don'ts, I guess, for these informal discussions, and they have a lot in common with the panel discussions, in that your job as moderator is to generate interesting questions, to steer the discussion back to interesting topics if it's sort of gone off the rails. But there are some idiosyncrasies about these unstructured discussions, too, that are worth mentioning. One of the biggest differences, I think, is that it's more important, even than in the formal ones, to focus on bringing in people into the discussion, partly just as an outreach thing on your part. You want people to feel like they're going to have a voice at these discussions, and also because there are more people, because it's more freewheeling, it's very easy to get into these states where you have just two people going at it and everyone else is sort of hanging out on the sidelines, which is unfortunate. So some basic things to pay attention to. Just the way you organize the chairs is important. I had this one discussion where I organized the chairs such that there were some people who had their backs to other people, and someone pointed out later that the people sort of in the back never said anything. So that makes a difference. You might also consider calling on people. I know it feels a little bit too classroomy, a little too dorky, but if you don't, it sort of rewards the people who are aggressive enough to really butt in and make their points. And I also personally find it stressful to have to constantly be poised and waiting, like, is this person done talking? Because I have to jump in really fast when they do, or else I'm going to miss my chance. And it's stressful. So that's another benefit to actually calling on people. I had one other thing to say about that, which is that managing the flow is really important. And you want to avoid letting people make multiple points at once in these informal discussions, because unlike in online forums where you can have multiple threads going at once, you really can only handle one track. So when someone starts out by saying, I have 3 points to make, interrupt and say, pick the best one. We'll go with that. So I'm running out of time, but in closing, I wanted to maybe share a war story with you that could maybe help you in the future. This was an informal discussion I was moderating for the Center for Inquiry about moral philosophy. And the discussion got heated. One of the, let's call her Mary, was bringing the discussion to personal areas, and it was making the other guests uncomfortable. And finally, one of the other guests, we'll call her Liz, said, Mary, this is just really inappropriate, and no one wants to hear this. Just not put as well as it could have been. And Mary was just so appalled and offended, and referred to Liz. I've been told not to swear because this is going on YouTube, so I'm going to just clean it up a little bit. And I believe her words then were, Liz, you are a witch. Which she then followed up by saying, no, you know what? You are a clucking witch. And this was like an out-of-body experience for me. I was like floating above the table, looking down at the girl like sitting in my chair, and like, how is she going to handle this? I have no idea. Oh my God. So what I ended up doing was promising Mary that I would have a discussion with her afterwards to apologize and to talk about what could be done differently next time. I actually broke that promise. I'm not necessarily endorsing this strategy, but the problem with group discussions is, as you've sort of gathered, one person can really ruin it for everyone else. And I didn't actually want to encourage her to come back. And I was afraid by mollifying her, she would actually be more likely to come back next time. I don't have a great solution to this problem yet. I feel like this was kind of a mean solution, and so I'd like to find a successful solution that's also not mean. If any of you have any ideas, I'd love to hear them. So far I haven't come up with anything. But I am now, my clock is reading -1 in very scary red font. So I'm going to wrap up and just say that you should go forth and moderate and learn things which you can then share with me, because I'd appreciate it. Thank you.
Excellent.